All right. Got that written
Hmm.
down. And I'll click go live.
Hmm.
All right, we are live. Ben Fisher, how you doing, sir?
I am well. Glad to be here.
Yeah, great to meet you. I actually stumbled across you because I watched Tom Jump's channel a lot, and you showed up on there. And
Right, right.
I have to say, so when he first asked you to introduce yourself, which I'll have you do in a minute, you said you were a pastor first. And don't take this
Mm.
wrong way. At first, I was kind of worried because typically when people are a pastor first and kind of an apologist second, and this isn't any offense against them in any way, but it's not always up to the same level as someone who's kind of an apologist first. But you, I thought, did such an excellent job. You were so well versed, and you handled his objections so well. I was really, really impressed.
Mm. Well, thanks. Thanks.
Yeah, absolutely. So I guess tell our audience a little bit about yourself. Maybe how you came to faith, what made you want to become a pastor, what got you interested into apologetics, all that kind of stuff.
Sure, sure. Well, my faith journey really stretches back to my childhood years. I grew up in the home of a Lutheran pastor, had a strong devotion to Jesus as a child, and that continued on until roughly the age of 17, when I really think I fully apostatized from the faith of my youth and squandered myself in wild worldly living. That continued for about 5 years, and at the end of that journey, I was nursing a number of chemical addictions in my life, and a lot of my life had gotten out of control at that point. And I was on a Christian college campus, and there was a number of evangelistic meetings that were happening all in a row as a protracted kind of week long, 2 week long series of revival type meetings. And there was an evangelist standing on the platform I'll never forget. His name was Sam Farina. There was a banner stretched across the front that read, Sam Farina saving a generation. And night after night, he would preach in that auditorium, totally packed out, 2,000 to 4,000 students there. And every night there were hundreds of young people at the altar giving faith commitments to the Lord or committing their lives to ministry. And that was really the season in my life when God met me in a renewed way and drew me back to faith in Himself. And so that was roughly around 20 years ago now. And my call to ministry came roughly the same week I returned to the faith. And I've been in full time ministry ever since, and went on to complete a seminary degree. I wound up in a local church out here in Minnesota, and did that for probably about 5 years before moving on into the work that I'm busy with these days in apologetics.
Hmm. So I guess what kind of sparked your interest from a mere just kind of being a pastor to specifically apologetics?
Well, when I started and launched the ministry that I'm currently engaged in, I spent about the first year and a half or so in the context of street evangelism. So, quote unquote, chance encounters, speaking to a stranger, striking up conversation about the faith. And it was in the context of those encounters that I began to realize that apologetics had a critical role to play in the work of evangelism and the work of Christian mission. I really gained a heart and a burden, I think, for this country, and I knew that I was called to really minister here and to be involved in the work of the harvest here in some sort of a dynamic way. And I just felt that this would be an important part to it all. And so this became a dominant emphasis for me about that time. And shortly after, our ministry launched the website. We've probably seen about somewhere between 20, 30,000 hits from around the world on the website. And that's been really great to see that turn into a ministry of sorts. And then also out of that, I began to speak itinerantly at churches, and I became an adjunct faculty member for Teen Challenge Leadership Institute, where I teach New Testament and I teach apologetics. And so, really, it's a number of different things that the ministry work that I'm doing now is comprised of. So, yeah, it's been an interesting journey and apologetics has wound up being a real central component to all this in a way that surprised me.
Yeah, well, it sounds like it because if you're kind of just out talking to people, a lot of those objections, it's not always, just kind of, oh, I haven't really heard the gospel or I'm kind of turned off from church. Sometimes it is these kind
Yeah.
of real intellectual things people struggle with. And I wish a lot
Hmm.
more churches would be engaged with apologetics. It's one of the things I'm working getting into my church because people don't always know about it.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Um,
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's very good. Yeah.
Yeah, so I did want to talk about two of the arguments that you went over on Tom Jump's channel because they're arguments that I think are very, very
Sure.
good arguments, but they're not as popular as some of the other ones, like the
Mm.
Kalam and the moral argument. So the first one was the axiomatic argument. So would you like to unpack that a little?
Sure. Well, as I understand it, the axiomatic argument essentially uh, argues that if we can even say that it's possible that a maximally great, metaphysically necessary being exists in some possible world, then it would necessarily follow that it exists in all possible worlds. And I find this to be very, very compelling as I have considered all of the arguments that I've encountered from the work of William Lane Craig and others. This one seems to me to stand out as particularly powerful. And so I've used it in my own ministry and I've seen good fruit.
Great. So what would you say is unique about God and his attributes that become axiomatic? Because Tom Jump's claim was, well, we could do this with naturalistic pantheism. We could have an eternal, all powerful nature that kind of pre-exists our known universe, but would necessarily give rise to any possible universe that would come in.
Yeah, this was sort of an interesting line of thought to me because it sounded as though he was essentially issuing an argument from skepticism for atheism, which was an odd approach to take. He essentially began the interview by saying to me, I'm an atheist, by which I mean that there are no good arguments for God's existence. And then he said something to the effect of, using any argument you believe proves God, I can craft a parallel case for belief in modified pantheism. And so therefore, since the arguments for God cannot disprove any of my arguments for pantheism, then they cannot succeed in proving God's existence. So how can you claim rational belief in Christian theism? Well, as I considered that sort of a question, I could immediately see that this was not really actually a defense of atheism at all. In fact, nothing about the substance of the challenge logically justified the claim that God does not exist, because after all, we might conjecture it may be true that God is real, despite our inability to sort of refute alternative theories. And so what therefore was this kind of a question really seeking to accomplish? It really didn't seem that his argument justified his position. And so I therefore began to see that he had kind of redefined his terms. He had assumed a sort of non-traditional definition for textbook atheism, because the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy, for example, states that atheism should be construed as the proposition that God does not exist. Essentially, that's exactly what it says. Atheism should be the proposition that God does not exist. And conversely, the argument that I was hearing was merely an attempt to somehow show that it is impossible to be certain or to have knowledge that God exists. And strictly speaking, that is quite different from the type of arguments that I'm normally accustomed to hearing from more standard forms of atheism. And so at that point, I began to sort of kind of group my thoughts together. I engaged in a sort of a brief bit of internal discursive thinking, because as leading experts have shown, the technical term atheism actually conveys more than just the mere absence of theistic belief. In fact, atheist philosopher Paul Draper has argued that this sort of a weak definition would actually wind up behaving itself preclusively towards standard atheism, which is kind of surprising. And at the very least, it would seem to show that it's unfitting for us to sort of reduce the concept of atheism to a mere psychological state of being. That kind of sounded strange to me. And so for that reason, I sought to kind of deal with the main issue as I saw it, which was his sort of misguided use of skeptical reasoning, because the trouble with such cases is that the argument of skepticism actually would serve to explode standard atheistic belief. And this is due entirely to skepticism's central claim, which denies our ability to attain to knowledge defined as certainty. And the problem, of course, is that This is precisely what the atheist is claiming, namely the knowledge that God does not exist. And that's kind of what makes it a bit strange. Now, to understand the issue, of course, is going to require a sort of cursory, loose grasp of what skepticism is. And the most primitive examples here date back to the 2nd century. And here, earlier inquirers were just severely sore perplexed, if you know your history, with their inability to relegate matters of doubt and uncertainty. And later thinkers describe the problem as sort of hinging upon a concept known today as the principle of deductive closure. The trouble is that most philosophers today agree that the closure principle is vital to virtually all forms of critical reasoning. So you can't just pitch the closure principle, you've got to actually deal with skepticism. And so, turning to Tom's argument, we immediately see the problem. If I know that theism is true, then I know that pantheism isn't. Well, according to this sort of argument, since we cannot disprove pantheism, then we cannot be certain that God exists. The problem is, for Tom, that the argument seems to work equally as well when we choose to point it in the opposite direction. Like so. If I know that atheism is true, then I know that theism isn't. But since I can't disprove God, I cannot be certain he does not exist. So you see, the problem here is really with classical skeptical reason. The argument seems to render all knowledge as impossible. In the case of any two sort of opposite propositions, skepticism holds that we're brought to essentially a philosophical stalemate. And so, for this reason, skepticism is a really poor defense of atheism, because it denies the very thing which the atheist is claiming. It holds that no propositional theory can ultimately be justified, a point which, if Tom accepted, would force him to actually plead agnosticism. And so that really seemed to me to be the weakness of the whole position.
Yeah. Like one of the analogies he often uses is if we have a box and we want to say there's a rabbit in the box, and our evidence that there's a rabbit in the box is that the box weighs 2 pounds. He's like, well, if your evidence is that it weighs 2 pounds, that could explain a gerbil in the box, or something, or a lizard in the box. It could explain these other things. And I think that's just, it's not to appreciate the sophisticatedness of some of these arguments that point to things like consciousness that would be incompatible with a lot of forms of naturalistic pantheism, as he puts it. And it's another thing to me, again, when we're talking about the sophisticatedness of these arguments and how they've developed over time, and the brilliant minds that have worked on some of these, for him to kind of just steal the conclusions and say, well, I can just apply all these properties to naturalistic pantheism, I don't think it works. And especially when it comes to things like consciousness. Like, one of the things you guys talked about a lot was the impossibility of an infinite regress. And, he wanted to say, well, maybe there's just some kind of natural law that can just pick a starting point. And I kept thinking the whole time, I'm like, well, wouldn't that be consciousness? If nothing else, if you have to just pick an arbitrary start point, how could nature do that?
Yes, yeah. I think that's this was, in my opinion, where we wound up spending a lot of time in our debate and our discussion. It was interesting to hear his comments here. I think that essentially what surprised me was his denial of simple axioms of transfinite mathematics, which hold that an infinite quantity cannot be either downwardly or upwardly adjusted. These are fixed quantities that cannot be changed. Infinity is not actually a number, it's just a concept. So infinity minus 3 would be infinity. If you say that infinity minus 3 is something other than infinity, then that would only be because you have now defined that concept with some sort of a numerical quantity. And so, to me, that was the point at which, in my opinion, the discussion, at least on the atheist end of the discussion, it kind of fell apart.
Yeah. Him and I, when I was on his channel, him and I kind of got into that, and being that it was my first ever kind of live encounter with in what you could call a debate, the closest thing I've been into a debate, I was so nervous that I couldn't really gather my thoughts properly.
You're cutting in and out just a little bit. It seems like you're cutting out just a tad.
Okay.
Are you still there?
I'm still here. I don't know if...
Hello?
Uh-oh. Can you not hear me at all now?
Have I lost it?
Perhaps. See if people here can hear me. I'm going to
go
to my Skype and try to adjust this.
Mm-hmm.
How about now?
Hello?
Uh-oh. It appears we are having some technical difficulties. See if I can't get into the settings here.
Yeah, it seems it's a bit
Choppy. Get into my settings.
okay.
Testing, testing.
That's a little bit better.
Okay. Good, so I'll try to leave it like this. Sorry.
All right.
Um,
Okay.
what was I saying?
Sure.
Oh, yeah, Tom and we got into infinites, and he was kind of telling me, well, there are different kinds of infinity. And immediately red flags in my mind went up. I'm like, well, no, there's one infinity, and it's a concept of a quantity without any limits. And the second you can differentiate any of them, you could only differentiate quantities by their limits if they had different limits. And so if you're talking about anything with limits, it's not infinity anymore. And I think you rightly pointed this out in the interview,
Mm-hmm.
which I didn't think of at the time was, well, what he was talking about was potential infinites, not actual infinites.
Yes, yes. Here, the distinction would be between essentially the symbol, which is often employed in mathematical terms. You have what's aleph, which is a Hebrew character that implies a potential infinity, while the lemniscat, which is the one that we're more familiar with, that would be the horizontal eight. That is an actual infinite quantity, and those are two different concepts. And so to speak as though they're the same, this is kind of a textbook case of sort of I think it's a problem. Essentially, it shows up in his definition of atheism. He's calling atheism something different from what it seems that it actually is, at least in technical terms. And so, yeah, I can't speak to the reasoning behind that, but
Um, well,
yeah.
what do you think? Because this is something I was thinking of as I was listening to it. Because you gave the analogy of the falling dominoes, right? And his response
Hmm.
essentially was
Yes.
to say, well, maybe actually, could you lay that out for our audience real quick?
Sure, sure. Yeah, I could do that. Well, essentially, the example I gave on sort of decamping skepticism would be the idea of an infinite row of falling dominoes. And so I label the illustration in my lectures with my students as the ever pending birthday. And here I just simply ask my listeners to sort of imagine that we have walked into a room with an infinite set of tumbling dominoes. And as we're looking at this row, this infinitely long row of tumbling dominoes, we can see that each successive 1 second to accomplish its sort of inevitable collision with the floor. And if we imagine that the row is utterly beginningless, leading to a final domino that is perched near your foot, you bend down, you notice that the domino bears an inscription which reads the exact date of your birth. And you then begin to wonder, if the set of dominoes is infinitely long, how much time will it take for my birthday to arrive? Well, of course, the answer is unavoidable. Your tile would never fall, and consequently, this would imply that you would never be born. So this implies that, therefore, we cannot have a past infinity of temporal events. There must be a number of them in order to have a string of causes that continue to cause things.
Yeah, yeah, I really like that analogy. And his response was, okay, well, maybe there's some law of nature. And by the way, this is something I notice he does quite often. Is he'll just appeal to, maybe there's a law of nature that can accomplish whatever it is we're saying God would stand in place for. And in this case, he was saying, well, maybe there's a law of nature that could just pick a random domino, in which case there would only be a finite amount of dominoes between that random pick and the birthday. But one thing, and you can tell me what you think of this, one thing that kept coming to my mind was, something we often say, which is, even if there were some kind of law of nature that could just pick a random starting point, why wouldn't it have, if the sufficient conditions of that law were always in place, why would they have not done it infinitely long ago?
I think that's essentially the crux of the argument that I was offering in the context of the interview. I just simply pointed out that here, if the cause is sufficient to produce the effect and nothing else is needed except that cause, and the cause has existed for eternity, then why hasn't the effect existed for eternity? I think that we have to say that the reason for that is because of the operation of some sort of a free agent has taken place to actually produce an effect in time that, unlike itself, is finite and limited in duration, as opposed to eternal in the past.
Yeah,
So,
yeah, and then he kind of got into you guys got into free will, and I do want to get there, but before we do, I did want to ask you
mm-hmm.
because he's talked about maximal greatness, because that's kind of the ontological argument, is if it's possible that a maximally great being exists, well then it follows that a maximally great being exists. And one of his things is, well, this idea of maximal greatness is just something we make up, right? We just make up these terms and then apply them to God. So I,
Sure.
I did want to ask you, because the axiomatic is the idea is that there are certain axioms that have to be true, and if you go back to the foundation, well, there has to be something that's foundational. It can't be something contingent that these axioms kind of lie within. So, what would you argue? Is it about the foundation of reality that is axiomatic, that you can't just that the atheist can't just throw up a hand and say, well, you just made up that attribute?
Well, let's what winds up being axiomatic about this, first of all, an axiom is not, as Tom attempted to argue, some sort of an idea that we all just sort of agree upon. This is axiomatic. We all agree that this is true. Axioms are not determined by consensus. When we speak of an axiom, and I'm borrowing the term quite self-consciously from the discipline of math here, axioms are self-evident, irreducible primes. They're things that we simply cannot conceptually erase. And this is what actually turns out to be the case when you study the idea of a first cause, that in any possible world that we imagine, a first cause has to exist. Well, if that is true, then that makes the concept of God unerasable. We can't just simply airbrush him out of any reality model or world that we imagine, any possible world. And so that's what makes it axiomatic, is that the first cause has to exist in every possible world, including, as you pointed out a moment ago, the matrix world. Even if it did turn out, for example, that I was just a brain floating in a vat of chemicals, well, it would still be the case that that sort of a world would need to have some kind of a finite beginning, because a brain cannot be invatted if its person were never actually born. So this leads us to the conclusion that therefore that matrix world itself had some sort of an inaugural set of affairs that gave rise to its existence. The scientist has to be there. You have to have a certain set of circumstances that sort of get that world going. And so, in my opinion, that indicates that since God is Lord of the Matrix, the skeptical argument has failed to sort of disemploy God.
Yeah, that's a great point. And I've been trying to work with this idea. Perhaps you could tell me what you think of this. That the laws of logic would be axiomatic, in the sense that they would have to
Yes.
apply in any possible world, including the
Yes.
matrix. Because I had an atheist tell me, well, the laws of logic, they're kind of just descriptions of reality, right? That reality just is the way it is, and for example, there just are no contradictions in reality, so therefore we kind of derive the law of non-contradiction as a way of describing it. The problem is that that would have to mean that were a different possible world to have come about as a result of the Big Bang, that the laws of logic would be different. And the problem there is, then you couldn't even make sense of basic principles like Descartes' I think, therefore I am. Because in a universe in which, for example, the law of non-contradiction doesn't apply, okay, in that universe, it would have to be possible for me to exist and simultaneously not exist. In which case, in that universe, I think that I can make the statement, I think, therefore I don't exist. The problem is in that universe versus this universe, I'm able to think in both of them, but the conclusion would be indistinguishable. So I couldn't actually conclude that I exist from my thinking if I don't know which world I'm in. And so in that sense, the law of non-contradiction has to be axiomatic in that it would be present in any possible world.
I think that this is a good point. It is actually even a bit simpler than this. Let's just try to imagine that we were in a universe where there were laws of logic. Then the atheist were to claim, as he does, that the laws of logic don't apply to things outside of the universe. Well, there he's using a law of logic, namely contradiction, to apply outside of the universe. And so therefore, the one thing the argument fails to do is debunk the laws of logic. It's circular. And see, these are why axiomatic rules like laws of logic or like the axiomatic argument for the existence of God always apply, because the laws themselves cannot actually be airbrushed out of any world that we imagine. So I sort of somewhat facetiously said to Tom in our interview, it was a good conversation, but I just said you plus me equals 2, whether we're standing in heaven, on earth, or in hell. It doesn't ultimately matter, because 1 plus 1 will always equal 2. And so, and that would be the case in any possible world. Descartes, by the way, actually admitted that was true. So it's interesting how that whole discussion shook out.
Yeah, well, and that's why I think that's another place I think naturalistic pantheism fails, because if the laws of logic, even if you want to ground them in something like naturalistic pantheism, well, this is something that's still naturalistic in its nature, in which case you're still saying that laws have to be grounded in nature, which if that naturalistic pantheism were to be different, then the laws of logic would have to be different. And so I don't think it works, because you still have to have nature coming before the laws of logic, which is why I just think it's more reasonable to ground them in a rational metaphysic.
Yeah, something that is coherent, logically coherent.
Yeah.
I think that's critical. That's right. I'd agree with that.
Cool. So before we get into the trilemma, I did watch a video you did where, and you just alluded to it, which is that even if we were in the Matrix, we could still conclude that God exists. So you think maybe you could just summarize that real quick?
Sure. Well, essentially here, I'm talking about arguments. The arguments from skepticism are legion at this point, but the one that's mostly pulled out these days, it's a little bit different than Descartes' original argument, which was a demon not less powerful than deceitful, who has availed himself with all of his strength to lay traps for my credulity. That's kind of morphed into sort of the scientific evil genius argument, which says that I'm just simply a brain floating in a vat. What is to prevent that from being true? Since it's possible that that's true, then I don't know that the world that I experience now is real, including my memories. So that's essentially the argument from skepticism. And I think here that if an argument like this is to succeed at, again, airbrushing God out of the picture, then it would be necessary to show that God could not be the God of that world. And as we discussed a moment ago, since we cannot even conceive of an infinite regress of past events, an infinite number of temporal events that have taken place going back infinitely long, infinitely deep, that therefore that the matrix world itself has to have some sort of a cause. That sort of a cause has to have free will. And essentially that was what I attempted to argue in that video. So
yeah, that's great. And he did have a argument, and he used this with me, and when he told me about it, it was the first time I had heard of it, so I hadn't had any time to think about it before I could respond.
Sure.
But it was the idea that there's this dilemma which makes free will impossible even in principle, which was if there's a reason for your choice.
Yeah.
And this was kind of some of the wordplay he used, which was he was using reason as a synonym for cause. And so if he was saying if there's a reason / cause why you made a choice, well then it was determined, because then whatever the reason for that reason was would have to keep going back, and so it's always going to be determined, or it's not. There is no reason you're making that choice, in which case it's random. And he seemed to say in each case there's no free will to play.
Yeah, here what's interesting is that as I offered him the model of compatibilism as opposed to strict determinism, he attempted to say that compatibilism collapses to a form of determinism. Compatibilism essentially is the argument that holds that the idea of predetermined states of being and my having the ability to exercise human freedom, that these two ideas are not mutually contradictory. And I think that compatibilism has made its case quite effectively. In fact, Daniel Dennett, whom he named, is a compatibilist and believes both in determinism as well as free will. So these aren't as mutually exclusive as one might be led to imagine. So it seems to me that he just simply wasn't able to push the point through here. He attempted to say that Daniel Dennett admitted that compatibilism is just a form of determinism, but that is just to simply, I think, misunderstand Dennett's arguments, at least as I understand them. So I simply told him that I would do a bit more reading perhaps on this point, but in my opinion, there wasn't an argument, just that there was a claim that there was an argument, and that's not the same thing as laying out a set of rational reasons. So I don't think he really carried through the argument well here. At least as far as I understand Dennett's arguments, he definitely is a compatibilist and holds to the possibility both that our events that take place in our life are preordered and predetermined, and yet it is also true that I'm exercising free will. One of the examples here that shows why these two are not mutually compatible actually shows up in the philosophical technical literature. Imagine that you are standing in a voting booth and you've got to cast a ballot for either Hillary Clinton or Donald Trump. Now, without asking you to sort of reveal who you voted for in the last election, let's just imagine that you're standing in the booth and you happen to be fitted with a machine that if you tried to vote for Hillary Clinton, it would make it impossible for you to do so. In other words, when you walk into the voting booth, you are predetermined to vote for Donald Trump, correct? Because the machine is there to stop you from voting for Hillary Clinton. But now let's imagine that you, out of your own human freedom, decide that you would vote for Donald Trump. Does that mean that just because there was a mechanism which would have prevented you from doing else, does that mean that therefore you didn't have free will? Well, no, because if you didn't have free will, then it wouldn't explain why it was that you decided to vote for Donald Trump. In other words, your vote would have no cause at that point. So therefore, free will has to be the cause of the reason for which you decided to cast the vote the way that you did. And I think that illustrates beautifully why these two can actually exist in harmony. And I don't see them as mutually contradictory. There are numerous philosophers who also agree on that point. This is not novel to myself. There are many who conclude that this is an accurate description, a sound description.
Yeah, well, I really like that one too, because one of the things I was thinking about is, there is some credit to his point as far as there being a reason why a choice is made. So, for example, I would say the mind, the immaterial mind that is me, is what's capable of navigating the world and making these free choices. Now, that's not completely devoid of any influence from the physical me, right? So, like, if I have a choice of what I'm going to have for dinner, well, the physical part that, for example, makes up my taste buds and kind of predetermines things I'm not going to like, you could say that has an influence on the choice, but I don't think that determines the choice. A better example would be Jordan Peterson has talked about if you do personality tests on people and you can figure out what their temperament is, we can very closely correlate someone's temperamental proclivity with how they're going to vote, whether they're going to vote conservative or liberal. But what he said is, with experience, people can actually move away from what they're temperamentally predisposed to vote as. So me, for example, I'm comfortable saying I'm temperamentally predisposed to vote liberal. I'm very high in trait openness, for example. But I've learned a lot of things, and through my studies, I've kind of decided to move away from what my personality would kind of, lean me towards, and I do vote more conservative on things. And I think that's just a good example of how, to Tom's point, there is a lot of physical influence that goes into it, and you could say that's deterministic in a sense. But I think if here's the mind and here you have all these deterministic factors, the mind can kind of evaluate and still make a free choice. And if he wants to say, well, there's a reason or a cause why you're making that choice, I would just say, well, the mind is the reason, it is the cause. That it's influenced by these things, but it's not determined by these things.
Yes, I would say that that's true. One cannot just simply rule out the mind as the cause. Now, obviously, determinism does do that very thing. Personally, I'm not a determinist.
Nor I.
I don't find the arguments to be persuasive here.
Yeah.
So
So the second argument you gave, and I actually hadn't heard this one prior to this. I know I was familiar with all the principles. I hadn't heard it put in the form of the argument before. It was the trilemma.
yes, Agrippa's trilemma, or sometimes as it's called in today's philosophical community, the Munchausen trilemma. They're just sort of a tip off to the famous Baron Munchausen, who pulled himself out of the quagmire by the hair of his own bootstraps. So essentially, the Agrippa's trilemma was an argument that was directed by Sextus Empiricus against Plato's Academy. Plato's Academy were exponents of something called direct skepticism, which was the belief that knowledge was impossible. And so essentially, Sextus held that the belief that knowledge was impossible was equally as dogmatic as saying that it was. In other words, to say that it's not possible is just as dogmatic as to say that it is. It's far more conservative to say we don't know. And so the way that he attempted to invoke agnosticism was by the use of this trilemma. And he has simply identified these three different ways to attempt to settle something as probative. And he felt that he couldn't ultimately decide which of these three alternatives was the right one. And therefore, he felt that this argument and the apparent inability to resolve the trilemma was itself an argument for agnosticism. And so, essentially,
real
the
quick
three...
before you leave this out, what do you mean when you say
yes.
that a belief is probative? Just so.
Probative, it's settled as truth conducive. It's proven to be true.
Okay.
So, yeah. So essentially, the three possibilities are infinitism, coherentism, and foundationalism. Infinitism essentially argues that in the event that we have contingent proposition A, that is, it is some sort of a proposition that we would say is true, but that's contingent upon further proof. Therefore, we go about according to what's called the rule of independence, and we say, well, if proposition A is true, it's got to be proven true on the basis of something other than itself. So infinitism argues that we say A is true because B is the proof, B is true because C is the proof, and on to proposition Z. The problem is once you get to Z, or you properly reach the end of the set, what do you do at this point? Well, the infinitist says that you have to continue the regressive proofs. And so therefore, if you're going to show that Z is probative, you're going to do so on the basis of, say, A prime. So Z is proven by A prime is proven by B prime, and this simply goes on to eternity. But that seems to be equivalent to saying that essentially the initial proposition that we worked with, contingent proposition A, is actually eternally contingent, in which case nothing is ultimately probative. That strikes most of us as counterintuitive, so we go in search of other arguments. That's what philosophers do. Well, the next possible way to settle something as probative is by the argument of coherency, which essentially says even if an infinite regress of proofs proves nothing, I mean, if every proof must be proven, then your proof proves jack. I mean, now you've got to go searching for another proof. So if that doesn't work to settle anything, then at least in that case, we can still say that Z is true because Y is the proof. In other words, we can take the warrant for the proof and just toss it like a basketball back to some previous member of the set. But that seems to be no different from saying that Z is true because A is the proof, which is patently circular. So I think that this doesn't work in the minds of most people either. That just seems to say that there's something wrong here. That doesn't really prove anything either. This is essentially what you see sometimes happening from philosophers who argue for reliabilism, or the idea that a reliable etymological process gave rise to this proof. Therefore, we trust that it is true. Science is reliable, so we just simply trust it. I think we're going to need something else if we're going to be able to even trust the deliverances of science, something that is going to ground it rationally. And so that doesn't work. And so then therefore we move on to the third argument that Sextus proposed, which was foundationalism. This is the idea that we just simply say Z is true because Z is the proof. Now, some people would say that doesn't really prove anything, but I would beg to differ. I would say that it does prove the thing in question, so long as we are not simply presupposing that Z is true or Z is probative. If we're not presupposing it, If we're saying that Z is actually an axiom, if it's axiomatic, that is, it's of the nature that's metaphysically necessary, we can't conceptually erase it, then we can say that that's a good thing to ground our logical arguments from. Because if you can't conceptually erase this thing, whatever you're saying that it is, if there's no reason to sort of raise a rational doubt against it, then I think that that's a good foundation to start with. In any case, I think it's a better alternative than the other two. And so, in that sense, I disagree with Sextus's conclusion. Sextus held that argument, that trilemma, brought about agnosticism. And that was the reason he raised it against Plato's Academy. But I think that actually he was overlooking one point, that as so long as we're not presupposing that Z is probative, but we're saying that Z is an axiom, then there should be nothing wrong with assenting to Z. I mean, an axiom, for example, A plus B is equal to B plus A. There's no reasonable way to gainsay that kind of an idea. It seems that it is, as I described earlier, a self-evident, irreducible prime. God is like that. We can't conceptually erase him, at least not reasonably. And so it seems that we're kind of stuck with God, as it were.
Yeah.
And I take that to be a good thing.
Well, so just to play devil's advocate a little bit, I could see somebody saying, well, how is saying something is an axiom any different than saying it's a presupposition? Because, the presuppositionalist, and I'm not a presuppositionalist, but the presuppositionalist would kind of argue the same way, whereas you have to just start with God in order to reason about anything. And it seems that they would be kind of using presupposition and axiom kind of interchangeably there.
Yeah, they're certainly welcome to do that. I think that would be a good move. It is not without reason that we say that God is real and the concept of God is the proof. That's not without reason, because we find out upon careful examination, upon critical examination, that is actually true. The presuppositionalist is saying that it's sufficient to say that God is real and then to not back that up with any other sort of further reason, to not sort of ground that in some sort of an axiom, but to simply say we presuppose it. Because if we don't presuppose God, then we lose the foundation for reason. Well, I would say, yes, that's true, but that's specifically because the concept of God is axiomatic.
Okay.
So, yeah, a presuppositional apologist would probably feel very comfortable with the concept of God that I just outlined, but perhaps they don't distinguish as carefully as I do these two things. A presupposition, as I understand it, is just simply blindly assumed. An axiom is found to be self-evident.
Yeah. Well, so stepping into the atheist's shoes, the atheist might say that all you're doing by saying something is an axiom that's just your way of presupposing it. And if someone were to ask, well, why should we presuppose this thing? You're kind of just saying, well, it's an axiom so that you don't have to explain it.
The process of axiomatization is not nearly as dark and mysterious as the conjecturious atheist in this case that you're presenting. It's not as random as he's trying to show, because axioms again are exactly what I've described by definition. They're self-evident, they're irreducible, and we can't conceptually erase them. When we discover that that's true, therefore, all doubts against axioms are themselves, they demonstrate themselves to be irrational. And without rationalism, I just don't think that we have any grounds for even the whole discussion of how to discover that something is probative in the first place. That becomes meaningless. On empiricism, for example, this entire discussion would be meaningless, because their empiricism is simply the close cousin of infinitism, which essentially holds that all proof is contingent, and then in that case, nothing is probative.
Right on. So I've been kind of pushing everything, asking all the questions. Is there any arguments perhaps you'd like to go over?
Yeah, I hadn't actually come onto the program thinking about something that I might offer. So as I think about that, I think that some of the things that we've discussed, at least in my opinion, are fairly provocative. They give the atheist a lot to think about as far as the existence of God. But from here, usually what you do in evangelism is you try to quickly begin to ask the question, well, what ways has this God that we're discussing revealed himself? And there's a number of different ways that we can use to show that that's true. One of them would be on the basis of fulfilled biblical prophecy. Others would be other arguments would include the resurrection of Jesus. The list goes on, a number of different ways that God has revealed himself in a decisive manner. And so certainly these are rich grounds. I mean, we do this every Sunday morning. We gather together and we make the argument for God's existence on the basis of fulfilled prophecy. Essentially, we're saying in three propositions, if the Bible issues genuine prophetic predictions, then God exists. Premise 2, the Bible does issue genuine, futuristic, fulfilled prophecies. Therefore, premise 3, or properly speaking, the conclusion, therefore God exists. So that's a very compelling argument in and of itself right there. And from there, you begin to delve into some of the fulfilled prophecies that we find in Scripture. They are abundant, and they are powerful.
Yeah.
Prediction of just massive geopolitical events, for example, before they happen, sometimes decades before they happen. This is phenomenal, not seen in the same respect in other quote-unquote sacred or holy books.
Yeah, so how would you respond to the I guess like the Christopher Hitchens type argument, which is, well, it's really easy to just kind of these are self-fulfilling prophecies. So if somebody predicts that the Messiah will come riding in a donkey, well then all you have to do is you get a donkey, you pop whoever you want your Messiah to be on top of the donkey and ride them in, and so they can just self-fulfill all these prophecies.
They can, yes, essentially. This is very, very similar to, I don't know if you've heard this before, but it's called the Black Swan theory. It was popularized more recently by scholar Nassim Taleb. And essentially, sort of the grand thematic predictions of the Black Swan theory have been considered by most to be very extremely compelling. This was dubbed as one of the top 12 most influential books, which was published in the Western world following World War II. And so this was a very, very extremely trend-setting book. It immediately caused a firestorm of controversy and discussion. And so in his own words, this is how Nassim Taleb defines a black swan, and I think gets right at the point that we're talking about. He writes as follows, quote, "A black swan is a highly improbable event with three principal characteristics. Number one, it is unpredictable. Number two, it carries a massive impact. And number three, after the fact, we concoct an explanation that makes it appear less random." Well, due therefore entirely to his own highly suspicious wording, Taleb's favorite theory is made impossible to question, because the moment we offer God as an alternative to random events, we have already, in a sense, proven that Taleb is right. So like, I'm going to issue a theory that says that I'm going to say that history is random, and you're going to say, no, it's not, it's possibly this. And I'm going to say, see, I told you were going to try to make up some way to show that my argument was wrong. Well, that doesn't prove anything. That's a bit like claiming that watermelons are really blue on the inside until the precise moment that you cut the skin. So that's an unfalsifiable theory. It doesn't really hold any water. What you've got to do is you've got to go back to the scriptures and ask yourself the question, is it true that the scriptures the prophecies themselves are truly indeterminate? Or is it possible that the predictions are narrow, extremely narrow, and extremely precise, and therefore defy the possibility of just being sort of retroactively made up or something like that? And so here, the best place to go, I think, would be the book of Daniel. Daniel chapter 2 is a tremendous example of a prediction of the history of Western civilization, stretching from Daniel's time straight to the emergence of Jesus, and the succession of four world empires that arise, that rule over the entire world. That is something that obviously would be a very unlikely thing, that just to peg that, for example. Why wouldn't this world empire immediately break up into a number of different warring factions and sects? Why wouldn't it just simply go back to the way it was before it was a world empire? Well, as it turned out, lightning struck 4 times. And what you find in this case is that it's not, this doesn't follow. It's not as though the Christian is playing intellectual jazz here. It's not like the Christian is sort of a man reading a Rorschach inkblot. He's just simply seeing what he wants to. The issue here is that the prophecies seem to be pointing to specific events that wind up taking place in extraordinarily compelling ways and unlikely ways. And therefore, this seems to be a genuine picture that that would show that at the very least, minimally, Daniel chapter 2 is a message that comes from outside of time and space.
Yeah, that's a great point. And this is a whole can of worms we've kind of opened as our time's coming to an end here. So perhaps if you would like to, we could have you back on, and we could do specifically go through some of these Old Testament prophecies and somehow they were fulfilled.
Sure. Yeah, we can certainly talk about that. Yeah.
So your website is benfisherministries.com. And there's a lot of resources. You can also follow him on Facebook. Go to his YouTube page. I have it down in the description. Ben Fischer Ministries. Make sure you subscribe. Help him grow his YouTube channel. Is there anything I'm forgetting about there?
No, I think that's it. It's been a great discussion. Great getting the chance to know
I really
you.
Appreciate it. I saw you the whole time I was watching on Tom Jump, and you said this is the first time you heard this. I think you look like Leonardo DiCaprio. Guys, let me know in the comments if anybody else, if it's just me, if I'm the only one seeing that, or if anybody else thinks it. Ben Fischer, thank you so much for taking the time, sir, and I hope to get you back on soon.
All right. Blessings, Stellman. Carry on. All right.